This isn't really a video, this is just a slideshow of the assembly process of my 22-year project, trying to get my 1971 MG Midget on the road from when I purchased it when I was about 19 or 20 years old. I took a good buddy's dad with me, and he suggested that he wouldn't touch this car with a 10-foot pole. And of course, like every other stupid kid, I just bought the car anyway and started tearing it apart. I'd already finished building one car. This was my second vehicle, and I figured I could build one, I can build another one. But this car was a lot worse than the first car I ever tried. So it went to my cousin's shop where he worked on it on and off as time allowed, over the course of many years, until eventually, when I was much older, the car finally came home. At this point, I figured it was probably time to put the engine back together. I had had it machined, and I'd purchased all the components required to rebuild the engine a long time ago when I first purchased the car. So the engine and head and everything had been sitting, and all the parts had been sitting for a lot of years, and certainly I didn't remember where any of it went, and I didn't have anything labeled in bags or anything, so all I had to go by was a Haynes manual, and I followed along, and the car has 200 miles on it, so it didn't blow up yet. This was a pretty cool part, putting the ring gear on. I put the ring gear into the grill, heated it up, and it dropped right over top of the flywheel. That was a pretty awesome thing. Painting the engine was satisfying, of course, because once it was all the way together, it looked very pretty when it was all brightly red painted. I know it's not an original color, but it's my car. And then after 15 years, with the body all finished and the car painted, just had finishing touches required. And then, of course, to get the engine and transmission put in. And then finally the car was all assembled, and a couple years went by, and the car was ready to move to the new house. Got loaded up onto a flatbed, and then once it was at the new house, of course, kids and family life, you get busy, and the car sat again until February of 2020, when all of a sudden I had a lot more time. And through the summer of 2020 and a good bit of 2021, I had a great opportunity to try and get this car finished. As I reassembled it, I couldn't put any of the dirty old parts back on, so rather than just trying to get the car on the road as fast as possible, I cleaned everything, as best I could. I don't have a sandblaster, so it was wire brush and sandpaper and thinners, etc. And then painted everything up, but at least when everything went back into the car, it looked good. I tried to clean up and repaint and replace, as few parts as possible, trying to keep the car not necessarily original, but really trying to keep the cost down, because it didn't take long to find out that pretty much everything I touch needed to be replaced as far as the mechanical components go. The carburetors were rebuilt twice. The first time I rebuilt them, I used a pretty cheap kit, and ended up finding that it was worth spending a little bit of extra money to get a better kit. And I didn't have, all of the correct components, so you may have noticed that one piece in the engine bay was a piece of copper plumbing that runs from the radiator up to the heater, but it works just fine. And then finally, I got to start the car for the first time after 21 years or so, and it was pretty exciting. Of course, once I found that the car was running, after I heated it up a few times, I discovered that the head gasket was leaking at the front, leaking oil out the side of the engine, right in front of, or right in front of and above the exhaust manifold. And so I pulled the head off and replaced the head gasket.
I don't know what that means.
While I had it off, I noticed that the two center cylinders were a lot dirtier
Now,
than
I know these are supposed to be the hot cylinders.
the front and the back cylinder. And
So this
looked
is
like there was a
where-
bit of discoloration on the cylinder wall in between those two cylinders too. So I suspect that the head gasket
there's
failed at least a little bit in that position.
no oil
And
gap.
hopefully that was just some burnt fuel and burnt oil that accumulated on those two cylinders in a very short amount of time. Since it ran fine for 200 miles, I have to assume that no damage was done, and we'll move on from there.
I'm just seeing if there are any that don't line up.
Before I could take the car to get it safety tested, I needed to replace a bunch of the suspension components. The A-arms were both pretty much shot, so I fully disassembled those and replaced the kingpins and replaced both of the A-arms. Cleaned up the brakes, rebuilt the calipers, which were a little rough but rebuildable. Reinstalled new wheel bearings in the fronts and the rears. Painted everything. Put the car, the suspension all back together again. Even painted the springs because while I was in there, why not? Painted the shocks black because they'd been sprayed orange with the rest of the car, and they look a lot better black. And then there are a couple of slides in here showing the front suspension all assembled. And I spent a little bit of time, including these slides just because I think it looks pretty when you've got all those new freshly painted components put together. And there's, a fair bit of money too in parts and certainly a lot of time. And I was going to reuse the old rotors, but it turned out to be crazy. They're just too inexpensive to not just buy new ones. And it's really easy to change the rotors on the car. And even though you can't see any of these components when the wheels are on, I felt like I needed to paint it all and make it look nice, even though it's only me who will ever see it. The pressure plates, the brake backer plates on the rear brakes, they were pretty crusty, and the adjusting screws were seized. So those had to come off, and while I had those off, I redid the rear wheel bearings. There's another video on that. And there's also a video on the seats webbing being replaced. And then with the car finished off mostly and had it safetied, I painted up the seats, and I used a vinyl, they call it a dye, but it comes out kind of like black spray paint. But it has stuck really well for an entire summer with the sun beating down on it and people sitting in the car. So that vinyl dye seems to have worked out really well. And I think for the cost of, putting on new seat covers versus cleaning up the seats and dyeing them, I would just probably clean them and dye them again if they ever get worn out. So thanks very much for taking a look. If you're not rebuilding a car, this might not be of much interest to you, but anybody who's got a big project like this probably appreciates how long it takes and, why it's of interest to a guy like me. And if it's not of interest to you, well, sorry you got this far.